Well, I'll just share the sort of introductory. A warm welcome to everybody, and especially to Rupert, as we start our conscious conversation session this morning. Just to explain the format, just trying to make this turn over the page. There we go. Our format is as on the screen there.
That's actually...
Sorry, I got the wrong title at the top there. That was the last one. But ignoring the title at the top there, we'll start with the group alignment in a moment, and then we'll introduce Rupert properly, and Rupert will give his first talk on morphic resonance rituals and festivals. Then we have the breakout rooms. Then there'll be a short comfort break of 10 minutes. And Rupert will give his second talk on the revival of pilgrimage, which should be interesting. And then another session, conversation, before we have a short Q&A and some closing intentions at the end. Just to say a little word about Cana. I think most of you are sort of familiar with the kind of idea of Cana. It stands for Christians Awakening to New Awareness. We've been going about 30 years now, since it evolved out of the Bridge Trust, which is kind of bridging between the kind of New Age ideas and Christianity at the time. And since then, we've kind of evolved, but we're still trying to bridge the gap between the understanding of spiritual realms and moving towards a more universal and inclusive excuse me, an inclusive understanding of spiritual experience. So although we're rooted in Christianity, we are out there on the very edge of it, I suppose, in terms of where we're coming from.
John, your video's not on.
I'm sorry, Bill, did you say something?
Your video is not on.
Oh.
You can't see them.
Oh, sorry.
Hello. Good morning. All right, I will show you because that
There he is.
Okay, so we're going to start in a moment, and please note that Bill is going to mute everybody first of all, and while the speaker is speaking, obviously please stay muted, but when we get to the breakout rooms you will have to unmute yourselves, and I think everybody knows how to do that these days with Zoom. So I'm going to hand over to Janice, who is going to light a candle and give us a centering alignment.
Right, I'm muting now. So Janice needs to unmute yourself.
Well, good morning, everybody. Lovely to see you all, and special welcome to Rupert joining us today. I'm going to light our candle, which I have here in front of me. It's standing in a circle of people, and that seemed to be suitable for a circle that we are today. And I think probably Rupert will agree that each circle that meets and ponders on these deeper issues is actually going into the morphic field and helping change to happen. So I think we have a part to play beyond our own interest here. And it also helps us connect with other dimensions of being, and taking further steps towards a universal understanding and for the restoration of spirituality. So let's light the candle, and we'll take 2 minutes silence just to tune in and center our hearts and minds together and think of our purpose in being here. And then Don will end us with a little music, so you'll know when the silence ends because the music will begin, if it all works. Okay. Okay. So as I light our candle, we dedicate this in gratitude for Rupert being with us and all the work that he's doing, and in loving connection as we converse together, knowing that at a deep level we all are one. So let's just close our eyes, if you're willing, and attune our minds together, our hearts together, and our intention to work together for a better world.
Thank you, Janice. Well, it now falls to me to introduce Rupert in a proper way. Dr. Rupert Sheldrake studied natural sciences at Cambridge University, where he took a double first-class honours degree and then studied philosophy and history of science at Harvard University in the States. But he returned to Cambridge and he took a PhD in biochemistry, and he became a director of studies in biochemistry and cell biology. But then he moved to India, and from 1974 to 1985, he was principal plant physiologist in Hyderabad, India, and he helped develop new cropping systems widely used now by farmers. And while in India, he also lived for a year and a half at the ashram of Father Bede Griffiths in Tamil Nadu, where he wrote his first book, A New Science of Life, published in 1981, in which he explained his theory of morphic resonance, for which he has, of course, become best known, and which he has extended into many other areas of understanding of how the world works. Some of his other books include the most recent, I think, The Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work, 7 Spiritual Practices in a Scientific Age, Science and Spiritual Practices Reconnecting Through Direct Experience, The Science Delusion, Freeing the Spirit of Inquiry, and so on. And he was named among the top 100 global thought leaders for 2013, and in 2022, for the 10th year running, he was recognized as one of the world's most spiritually influential living people by Watkins Mind, Body, Spirit magazine. And so we're very pleased to have Rupert joining us today to talk about morphic resonance, rituals, festivals, and the revival of pilgrimage. So thank you very much for joining us, Rupert, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, yes.
Good. Well, it's very good to be with you. I'm just going to change the view system so I can see everyone. Very good to be with you, and how nice to start with that quiet period and that very beautiful music. I really appreciate that. Morphic resonance is a hypothesis about memory and nature. And what the hypothesis proposes is that the whole universe has a kind of memory. The so-called laws of nature are more like habits that evolve along with the rest of nature. Each species has a kind of collective memory given by morphic resonance. Each species of plant tunes into the forms of past members of the species, which is why it grows in the way it does. All animal species have collective memories through which they inherit their instincts. So what I'm proposing essentially is that there's a memory principle working throughout the natural world, which of course also works on us and through us. And this is very controversial within the sciences because ever since the 17th century, the sciences have been locked into what was originally a theological view of nature, namely that God was a kind of mathematician and that the laws of nature were kind of eternal ideas in the divine mind, and that scientists were revealing the true nature of God through science, which in the 17th century they thought was giving science a more direct insight into God's nature than religion, based on conflicting interpretations of ancient texts. The scientific view was usually thought to give direct insight into the mind of God. Well, many scientists are now atheists and don't think it's all about the mind of God, but the idea of eternal laws of nature has persisted from this 17th century theology as a kind of unquestioned assumption. And even though most scientists never think about it, it's built into the very method of science. Any experiment should be repeatable anytime, anywhere, because the laws of nature are the same at all times and in all places. By contrast, in an evolutionary universe, where the entire universe started very small, very hot, and has been growing and expanding ever since, much more like a gigantic embryo or organism than like a machine following fixed laws. There may not be all these fixed laws like a kind of cosmic Napoleonic code given at the very moment of the Big Bang that spring into existence from nowhere. Instead, there may be this memory and the building up of habits. This is a testable hypothesis, and it predicts that when you make a new chemical compound and crystallize it, there won't have been crystals of that kind before. So a new field of organization, a new morphic field has to come into being. But then when you keep making the same compound anywhere else in the world, there'll be influences from the first crystals and the second and the third and the fourth crystals and so on, a build-up of cumulative influence that makes it easier to crystallize. And this is well known to chemists. New compounds get easier to crystallize. They usually explain it by saying, well, there must have been fragments of previous crystals blown around the world in the atmosphere as invisible dust particles. Possible, but could easily be tested by filtering out invisible dust particles. The same applies to learning. If rats learn a new trick in one place, rats elsewhere should be able to learn it quicker. And it applies to commonplace examples as well. For example, the word puzzle Wordle that many of you will be familiar with involves solving a word puzzle with 5 letters. My wife is very keen on it, and so I get to see this in action every day. I would predict, on the basis of morphic resonance, that it should be easier to solve the Wordle puzzle in the evening than in the morning, because millions of people will have done it by then, and it should get easier to do. I've done surveys that show that actually many people do find it's easier in the evening than in the morning. I've also done surveys about crosswords. This came to my attention first by people saying they found it was easier to do the Times crossword the next day rather than the day it was published, because so many people have already done it. So Wordle would provide a very good test. I tried to get hold of the raw data from the New York Times, who now own Wordle, but unfortunately they're terrible spoilsports and said that the data were private and they weren't going to investigate it and so on. I suppose they just want a quiet life. I mean, if Wordle became the focus of a major scientific controversy, it would deflect them from their regular purpose in the games department. Anyway, there have been tests, and there are many ways of testing it. And I think that in an evolutionary universe, morphic resonance makes a lot of sense, but I should just make it clear this is still very controversial scientifically. It has many implications. It's based on similarity. The more similar something is, the more it will resonate with a similar pattern of activity in the past. And that means within a species, members of the same kind of variety will resonate more with, say, sheepdogs, or resonate more with past sheepdogs than they will with pugs or Afghan hounds. In the human realm, it's very similar to the idea of the collective unconscious of Jung. And on the basis of similarity, the hypothesis suggests that the people who are most similar will resonate more, and that would mean identical twins. Even if separated soon after birth, they would have a particularly strong morphic resonance, so their lives would show many parallels. And indeed they do. But this is usually taken to mean it's all in the genes, whereas I think it's not in the genes. I think it's a morphic resonance effect. The usual view of biological inheritance is that it's all in the genes, but actually genes only account for a small amount of inheritance, namely the kinds of proteins we can make and controls over protein synthesis. They don't really account for the forms and shapes of organisms nor their instincts, and I think those are inherited by morphic resonance. As a result of the Human Genome Project and other genome projects, it's become clear that genes, in fact, only account for a fairly small amount of inheritance, up to 10% of most characteristics, often less than that. And the rest of the inheritance is not explained genetically. This is called in science the missing heritability problem, which has become a major issue in biology in the last 10 years or so. Anyway, this is all by way of background about morphic resonance and the way it applies in many circumstances. Where it becomes a relevance to spiritual practices is when we look at repetitive activities within religious and social traditions, like rituals. In rituals, people perform particular words, actions, gestures, and they do them usually in a very conservative manner, in a similar way to the way it's been done before. The liturgy of the Coptic Church in Egypt, for example, is in parts in ancient Egyptian, the only form in which that survives. The liturgy of the Russian Orthodox Church is in Old Slavic. Sanskrit is the language of Brahminic rituals in India, even though it's no longer spoken. And so very often there's the survival of archaic languages in rituals and many other conservative elements. If we take it just at the level of language or words, then mantras are words or phrases which are used repeatedly in rituals and in prayers and in other contexts, and for meditation. And what I'm suggesting is that in a mantra, there's a triple form of resonance. First of all, there's the resonance in your own body as you chant the mantra. Different bits of the body vibrate with different vowel sounds. We don't have time this morning to do it, but if you want to check it up, you can try doing different, block up your ears and do R, A, E, different vowel sounds, and you'll find them resonate in different parts of your body. Secondly, if you're chanting with other people, then you're breathing together or singing together. You take breaths at the end of each line of a hymn, so the whole group is resonating together in rhythmically entrained with each other. And thirdly, by chanting these words, I think we come into morphic resonance with those who've done them before. It's the same words, the same sounds, the same vibratory pattern, perfect conditions for morphic resonance. So mantras can connect us to those who've done them before and to ourselves doing them in the past, and indeed to a whole tradition. And all traditions have their mantras. The best known one in the Judeo-Christian tradition is Amen. Its original pronunciation is Amen. That's how it's written in the New Testament in Greek with the long eta, the E. It's how it's said in the Orthodox Church. It's how Muslims say it. And actually, if we had time, we could do an experiment, but you can do it yourselves. And if you try chanting Amen and Amen on a single note, then I think you'll find Amen has a completely different quality to it. And I myself prefer chanting Amen, and because that's the original form that would tap into the resonance better, I think. Although in the West, we've built up a long, big resonance for Amen as well. Anyway, in rituals, there's in commemorative rituals, there's a performance of actions that relate to some original story in the history of the group. So, for example, in the Jewish Passover festival, there's a reenacting of the Passover meal that happened on that fateful night in Egypt, when God is believed to have killed the firstborn of the Egyptians and of their cattle, but spared the Israelites because they'd killed instead a lamb or a sheep and smeared the lintels of their house with the blood, so they were passed over. And this is the pivotal point that opens up their journey through the wilderness to the promised land, freedom from slavery, a key point in Jewish history, which is reenacted every year in the Passover festival with meat, with bitter herbs, the telling of the story, reenacting of that original ritual. And by taking part in it, people affirm their Jewish identity. Children are included in this, and the youngest child asks, why is this night not like every other night? And then the older elders reply by telling the story. And this is repeated year after year, in the same way, the right kind of food, the right kind of herbs, the right time of year, the same story. And by taking part in it, the participants affirm their Jewishness, they're part of that community, and by repeating what's gone before, connect over time with all those past generations who've performed the same ritual, right back to the first Passover. Now, that's a sort of familiar kind of ritual, but you'll notice that by doing things in a similar way as possible, there's a morphic resonance or potential for morphic resonance with those who've done it before. Normally, morphic resonance happens unconsciously and underlies habits. In this case, the repetition is conscious, and I think creates the conditions for morphic resonance. In the Christian Holy Communion, itself a Passover meal originally, Christians commemorate the Eucharist, the Last Supper of Jesus with his disciples. And again, there there are ritual gestures, ritual actions, the ritual eating of this ritual meal, the bread and the wine, which reenact a commemorative story. And this connects Christians with each other in the present community. They become Christians through sharing in this communion, and they share with all those who shared it before. What is the communion of saints, I think, is really all those. It's the blessed company of all faithful people. It's all those living and departed who shared in this meal. And through sharing in this ritual, we connect with all those who've done it before. Spiritual practices are about connection, both with God, nature, and other people. And in this case, we're connecting with other people and with particular pivotal historic event, namely the Last Supper of Jesus with his disciples. And there are secular rituals as well, like the American Thanksgiving dinner, which is really a big deal for Americans. And when they gather together, they have this dinner of Thanksgiving, which reenacts the original Thanksgiving dinner or dinners on the east coast of the US by the first settlers, who gave thanks as a kind of harvest festival for the survival, their survival in this new world. And so Americans, by taking part in that ritual, connect with the original settlers from Europe on the East Coast and in their national Thanksgiving. And rituals, commemorative rituals, have this general pattern that they're conservative from the atheist or secularist point of view. This is just another proof of religion's nothing but mumbo jumbo. But actually, these rituals have this connective power. And this is true in all cultures. They all have their rituals, even secular cultures. Even the Soviet Union, when it was at its most communist, had its national rituals and festivals and so on. Some rituals are rites of passage, which are not commemorating a particular event in the group, but rather the transition from one social role or pattern to another, like rites of passage at puberty, at weddings, baptisms, or naming ceremonies of children, and of course funerals, rites of passage to the world beyond. So again, those have the same kind of pattern, that through doing the ritual in a similar way, then it connects with those who've done it before. Of course, rituals do evolve. It's not as if we're doing exactly the same thing that people were doing in the time of St. Paul. The rituals evolve, the language evolves, the translation from Latin into the vernacular at the Reformation was an evolution. There are constant changes in rituals, but usually when people reform a ritual, they don't say we're doing something totally new. What they say is we're going back to the original form, which has since been lost, or connecting with some more ancient tradition. And I think that's very important in the nature of rituals. Related to the whole topic of ritual are festivals, which are, as it were, ritual celebrations at different times of the year. And there the festival binds the whole community to the seasons of the year. In Europe, the traditional festivals were at the solstices and equinoxes, and at the cross-quarter days, the intermediate points between them. And we still have this series of festivals in their Christianized form. Christmas, just after the winter solstice, Candlemas, which we've just had, February the 2nd, which is an old fire festival in the pre-Christian world, and it's a fire festival now with the candles. Then Easter, which falls, as you know, on the first Sunday after the first full moon after the vernal equinox. So it's both lunar and tied into the solar cycle. festival of death and rebirth. The next one is May Day, which is an ancient European festival that's been least Christianized, but is still a major festival. Then the summer solstice, June the 21st, is celebrated a few days afterwards as St. John's Day, the Midsummer's Day. And this in Europe was always a time of great celebration. It was a fire festival when people would dance and rejoice and have fun. It was always a major time of festivity. I should say, I'll go on with the other festivals, but one thing that the Puritans absolutely hated, with the Reformation in general, but the Puritans in particular, was these festivals. People were having much too much fun, and so they tried to stamp them out. They even abolished Christmas for a while, but they stamped out May Day, and the maypoles were cut down all over the country, and the celebration on Midsummer's Day. But it's interesting, you see how these patterns recur. If you look at the Glastonbury Festival, which is a revival, as it were, of a great summer festival, it happens over Midsummer's Day. And about 10 years ago, I was staying with a nephew of mine who lives in Pilton, where the festival happens, and made it much more convenient attending the festival, being able to sleep on his sofa rather than in a tent awash with about a foot of mud. I make a practice of going to church wherever I am on a Sunday morning. So I went to church at Pilton Parish Church, and I was astonished to see that Pilton Parish Church is dedicated to St. John the Baptist, and June the 24th is St. John the Baptist Day. Midsummer's Day is St. John's Day. And as the service got going, the sounds of the festival were wafting up into the church. And at the end of the service, I said to the vicar, I congratulated him. I said, "You've got the biggest patronal festival in England." And he looked completely blank and said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Well, it's the feast of St. John the Baptist. Your church's patronal festival. In the Middle Ages, the whole village would have been celebrating. And look what's happening now. 250,000 people having a fantastic time celebrating in the parish." And so it's remarkable, you see, the way these things return. And then if we go on through the year, the Lammas is at the beginning of August. Then shortly after the autumn equinox is the Feast of St. Michael and All Angels, which I personally love as a festival. It's the festival where we remember all those forms of intelligence and mind and agency beyond the human level. I personally think that the stars and planets are conscious beings, and that, as in the Middle Ages, people thought of them as guarded by or guided by angelic intelligences, that we live in a living universe full of intelligences and life and minds. And the angels remind us that it's not just conscious human beings and God. There's vast numbers of forms of intelligence and being in the universe, seen and unseen. And so I find that cosmic opening provided by Michaelmas very, very helpful. I usually go to the service at Westminster Abbey, which they do wonderfully well. They usually have about 7 priests in golden robes, incense, the choir singing songs about the angels, the most sublime music. It's a wonderful festival. And then between that and Christmas, the Festival of the Dead. Halloween, the eve of the festival, 31st of October, then All Saints' Day, the Blessed Dead, and All Souls' Day, everyone else. Again, most cultures have a way of connecting with the ancestors. And in our culture, this has been much suppressed and very much lost through the Protestant Reformation, which abolished the cult of the dead and suppressed All Souls' Day. It's revived in the Church of England, fortunately, and we now have proper requiem masses in many churches for All Souls' Day. In our own parish church in Hampstead, every year my wife Jill Peirce gives a workshop about family constellations and so on, which happens over All Souls' Day. and our vicar has one for the regular church anyway, but there's a special one for this workshop group. Others can come if they want, but where people can have the names of their ancestors read out and chanted, in fact. And it's astonishing, through Jill's workshops, where many of the participants are non-Christian, they're spiritual but not religious, or some are Jewish, some are Muslim, some are lapsed Catholics, and so on. Very few of them are sort of regular practicing Anglicans or Roman Catholics. But in seeing the context of this as a remarkable opportunity to connect, honor and connect with the ancestors, this is enormously powerful for most people. And most of them would never think of going to an All Souls Day service normally. But I've seen over and over again, year after year, how this can have such a very, very powerful effect. So I think these festivals, which are like annual rituals, can play an extremely important role in connecting us with each other, with tradition, with holy places, and with the wider community. Well, that's enough just to summarize some of the key ideas here. And I think that's the end of my allotted time, but we'll return to discuss pilgrimage in the second section, which takes up some of these themes and it goes further with them.
Thank you very much, Rupert. Absolutely fascinating. We're now going to have the opportunity to go into breakout rooms to discuss, and I'll bring up the question we're going to discuss. Hang on a moment while I share the screen. So we have, we'll do introductions first, just to be, so we know who we are in the breakout rooms. There'll be about 6 to 8 people, I think, in each room. But really to discuss these topics. How does morphic resonance help your understanding? What's your experience of the power of ritual, and what new rituals have you appreciated or would you like to see? And of course, it depends on our own experience as to how we interpret these, what experience we've had of all sorts of things in the past. And as Rupert has indicated, how that ties in with the past, the rituals that have come down through the years. So I'm going to stop sharing that. What I'm going to do is put the questions into the chat so that you will have them when you get into the breakout rooms. So there, I've put them into the chat. If you want to see the chat, you just click on the thing that says chat. It's usually along the bottom of your screen somewhere. So Bill is going to send us off into breakout rooms in a moment. Each breakout room will have a facilitator. Sometimes we have to sort of reorganize things because they don't quite work out properly. So if somebody suddenly disappears from your breakout room, it's because they've been reassigned to another one. So Bill, hope you're about ready to send us into breakout rooms. There'll be a little invitation comes up on your screen to join one of the rooms. We're all back together again now, I think, Bill.
That's right. Yeah.
So we're going to take a short break now until 11:35, and then Rupert will be talking to us about pilgrimage. So I'll put up the break screen and we'll see you in a short break. Welcome back, everybody. I think most people are back with us now. That's good. And Rupert's now going to talk to us about pilgrimage, which is a particular interest of mine. As many of you know, I'm out in West Wales in St David's, and it's the 900th year since Pope Calixtus II declared that 2 pilgrimages to St David's were worth 1 to Rome, and 3 to St David's were worth 1 to Jerusalem. And we have a revival of pilgrimage going on right here at this time. So Rupert, fascinated to turn over to you and hear what you have to say.
Well, there is indeed a revival of pilgrimage going on all over Europe. It started really with the Camino of Santiago de Compostela. And that was revived. It was always a major pilgrimage route in the Middle Ages, hugely important. But by the 20th century, the number of pilgrims had reduced to a mere trickle. And a group of Spanish and French poets and artists got together to try and revive the route. And in the 1980s, they built up the infrastructure so there were places for people to stay along the way. If you're going to have a long distance pilgrimage, there have to be places for people to sleep and get food on the route. So they got the infrastructure in place, and the Camino in more or less its modern form was relaunched in the 1980s. And in 1987, 1,000 people walked to Santiago. In 2019, 350,000 people walked there. So there's been a huge growth in that particular pilgrimage, which in a sense has helped to catalyze the revival of pilgrimage all over Europe. So and many of the people who go on the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela are not all devout Catholics. I mean, there are many people from other forms of Christian faith go. Many people are spiritual but not religious. Even atheists go on this pilgrimage. So it's attractive to lots and lots of people, way beyond the normal circles of churchgoers. Although, of course, it includes people who are regular churchgoers as well. And this has led to a revival of pilgrimage routes all over Europe. For example, in Scandinavia, the route to the Cathedral of Trondheim in Norway, where the shrine of Saint Olaf, the patron saint of Norway, is, the route from Oslo over the mountains to Trondheim has now become, in the last 10 or 15 years, a very important pilgrimage route in Northern Europe. And there's been a revival of pilgrimage going on all over the place. Well, what's going on here? Firstly, I'd like to make the point that pilgrimage is deeply archetypal. Our ancestors were hunter-gatherers. Settled agriculture began in Britain only about 7,000 years ago, if that. And the people who lived there before that were hunter-gatherers. And all over the world, everyone was a hunter-gatherer until about 10,000 years ago. And hunter-gatherers, by the nature of their lifestyle, move around the landscape. They have to move around to hunt and to gather because animals and fruits and things don't come to them. And they usually have a particular route circuit they go on. The Australian Aborigines call these song lines. And when they reach significant places in their annual journey, they have ceremonies, they tell the story of the place and so on. When people settled, then they created places that they went to as a kind of pilgrimage for festivals. Stonehenge, for instance, was a festival center. It wasn't a temple in the middle of a city. It was a center to which people converged for festivals at solstices, for example. And one could say that that was a kind of pilgrimage, that they were going to that festival. Our Lord did the same in Jerusalem, where Jewish people went on pilgrimages to Jerusalem for major festivals, including the Passover. And we find pilgrimage in all traditions. In India, there are pilgrimages to the great temples, to the holy river of Ganges at Varanasi, to Mount Kailash, the holy mountain in Tibet, to the southern tip of India, Kanyakumari, and to the other great temples. Many pilgrimages still going on in India. Muslims go to Mecca and also to the shrines of Sufi saints, which those again are major pilgrimage centers in India, particularly the shrine at Ajmer in Rajasthan. which is absolutely inundated with Muslim pilgrims. I've been there myself. It's hard to squeeze in even to the compound. So everywhere we find this tradition of pilgrimage, Buddhists go to Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha was enlightened, and so on. Well, in the Christian world, there were many pilgrimages. In medieval England, as everyone knows, one of the main sites of pilgrimage was the shrine of St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury Cathedral. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written around 1390, was a key part of that, describing the pilgrims as the stories they told each other on the way. The Shrine of Our Lady at Walsingham was another very major place of pilgrimage. And there were many others, the Shrine of St. Etheldreda at Ely, St. Hugh at Lincoln, and so on. However, a huge change occurred with the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant reformers didn't like pilgrimage, partly because they were scholars and they realized that many pilgrimages were rooted in the pre-Christian past, that it was an ancient kind of tradition, and that made them suspicious of it, even though most Christian pilgrimages were to the tombs of Christian saints. Secondly, they didn't like it because people were having too much fun. It was a way of going on holiday. People didn't just go on holidays then. They went on pilgrimages. It was a way of traveling together and getting out of your normal rut of activities and doing something totally new and adventurous. And also at the Reformation, they destroyed the infrastructure for pilgrimage, which in the Middle Ages was the monasteries, which provided places for pilgrims to sleep and be fed on their journeys. And the monasteries were privatized by King Henry VIII. And so that whole infrastructure was abolished. In 1538, the injunction against pilgrimage issued by Thomas Cromwell here in England in the name of the king forbade pilgrimage and made it an offense to go on a pilgrimage. So similar things happened in other Protestant countries. Pilgrimage was suppressed in North Germany and Scandinavia and elsewhere. It wasn't suppressed in Catholic countries, of course, where it continues to this day. But it was then suppressed for other reasons, for anti-religious reasons, not rather than Protestant reasons. In the French Revolution, when the church was abolished in 1793 during the Reign of Terror, the Roman Catholic Church was abolished and replaced by the cult of reason as the state religion. The Cathedral of Notre Dame was turned into a temple of reason, and pilgrimage was suppressed as part of the French Revolution. And then as part of the Soviet Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, it was suppressed in Russia. In the 1930s, the League of the Militant Godless, numbering about 5 million people, a bit like the Red Guards in China, went round Russia trying to eradicate every last trace of the Christian past, destroying monasteries and churches, forbidding church bells to ring, and forbidding any form of pilgrimage. So pilgrimage has been suppressed both by Protestants and by atheists. And I think the suppression of pilgrimage in England, suppressing what's a very basic human instinct to go to holy places on foot, was one of the reasons that the English invented tourism. I think tourism is best seen as a form of secularized pilgrimage. Tourists still go to the great holy places, the temples of India, the cathedrals of Europe, and so on. But when they get there, they have to pretend that they're modern, rational people who've risen above the mumbo-jumbo of religion and superstition, and that they're there because they're primarily interested in art history. And so guides spring up to fill them with facts. You know, this building was built in 1222 and there's 25,000 tons of stone on every aisle of the building, etc., etc. Facts that go in one ear and out the other, because they're not really there for that reason. I think it's best seen as a form of frustrated pilgrimage really, tourism, because people can't light a candle or say a prayer or kneel down when they get to these places. They have to pretend they're there for a secular reason. I think one of the big paradigm shifts that we're seeing at the moment is the shift from tourism back to pilgrimage, which is much, much more satisfying. The pilgrim goes on the journey with an intention, and that intention can be to give thanks to the God or saint at the holy place, or the Supreme Spirit, or however it's interpreted, can give thanks or to ask for something, like ask for healing, or ask for a blessing, or ask for good fortune, ask for blessings on a wedding, or whatever. There's many reasons people go on pilgrimages. Some of them are primarily about healing, like pilgrimages to the healing shrine at Lourdes in France. But others can be pilgrimages for inspiration. And so going on a pilgrimage for a blessing is, or with a reason, an intention, is much, much more satisfying than going as a tourist and pretending that you're primarily interested in art history. Now, of course, art history is important and interesting, but it's not usually the primary motive, and it wasn't the primary motive of pilgrims in the Middle Ages either. Well, here in Britain, the revival of pilgrimage is being helped by an organization called the British Pilgrimage Trust, which has now been going for about 10 years. I was one of the founders of it, and the British Pilgrimage Trust is doing several things. Partly it's been opening up the old way to Canterbury from Winchester and Southampton. So there were many routes to Canterbury, just as there are different caminos to Santiago. And this one goes over the South Downs, takes about 3 weeks. And one of the things the Trust is doing is finding places for people to stay along the route. Because if you want to do this and you stay at inns and Airbnb, the costs are going to mount up beyond most people's pocket. We've now persuaded quite a number of village churches to allow pilgrims to sleep in the churches. And in fact, we're setting up sanctuary church networks throughout Britain. There are some in Wales, some in Herefordshire, some along the route, the old way to Canterbury, and in other parts of the country. Sometimes they sleep in church halls, and we're trying to find hostels and campsites and so on where people can sleep, to make this available on a low budget, so it's open to everyone. The British Pilgrimage Trust also has guided pilgrimages, which have happened in various parts of the country, including a very popular one in London, within London, starting from the Tower of London, going through All Hallows by the Tower, St. Magnus the Martyr, both of them ran churches, then to St. Mary, Alder Mary, takes in the Mithraeum, the Roman temple that's been excavated and beautifully restored recently, St. Paul's Cathedral, St. Bride's Fleet Street, the Temple Church in the Inner Temple, at the Crusader Church, the medieval Crusader Church at the Temple, then along the embankment past Cleopatra's Needle to Westminster Abbey, where the whole pilgrimage culminates with choral evensong at Westminster Abbey. And the British Pilgrimage Trust has also developed in the last 3 years a series of one-day pilgrimage routes to all the cathedrals in Britain. And these one-day routes are usually 5 or 6 miles. You start from a village church, you go past holy wells, ancient trees, and so forth, across the fields and through the woods to the cathedrals. And again, we recommend that people time it so they get there in time for choral evensong, which is a wonderful way to celebrate the arrival at a great sacred place like a cathedral, to experience it echoing to sacred chant. The beauty of the music is even more beautiful when you've walked there, sometimes through mud. And these one-day pilgrimages make this very accessible for people, of course, who are able to walk. I mean, this is, but you can also do these with much shorter routes. Even a short visit, short journey to a cathedral can be made into a micro pilgrimage if you go with an intention. And not just cathedrals, other holy places too. I myself have been doing one-day pilgrimage routes for years now. About 10 years ago, no, less than that, 7 or 8 years ago, I have a godson who turned 14, and for his birthday, I didn't know what to give him, and I've stopped giving stuff for presents because most people have got too much stuff. I give experiences. And so because I got interested in British pilgrimage at that time, I said to my godson, who wasn't particularly religious, you know, for your birthday, I offer you a pilgrimage to Canterbury. We take the train to a village about 7 miles from Canterbury. We walk through the fields, the woods. We have a picnic on an ancient tumulus, and we go to a healing well. We go to Canterbury Cathedral, light candles at the shrine of St. Thomas. We go with an intention, have a cream tea, and then go to choral evensong, and then come home on the high-speed train. I said, would you like to do that? And without hesitation, he said yes. And that was the most wonderful day for both of us. The next year, we walked along the banks of the Cam to Ely from Waterbeach. The next year, Lincoln. The year after that, Winchester, then Wells, and Chichester. So that was a marvelous way to spend time with the godchild. And actually, I think this is something that could be done much more widely. The country is full of underemployed godparents. And I think that taking godchildren on a pilgrimage is a wonderful way of being a godparent. And it doesn't require the child to sign up to the creed or to undergo instruction first. You can do this. And I'm a firm believer in the principle that for the many people who are not practicing Christians in our country, for many of them, reconnecting with the Christian tradition through a positive experience is much more effective than trying to persuade them by exegesis of the Gospels or something, or from books. Experience is much more powerful. And a pilgrimage is a very powerful and simple, easy to do experience. One of the things that the British Pilgrimage Trust is interested in at the moment is promoting school pilgrimages. And I think starting with church schools, because then if you have a pilgrimage from a church school, you don't have to argue with atheist parents who object to anything Christian. If the parents have sent their children to a church school, then they've already signed up for something Christian. And one of the pioneers in this is somebody who's you wouldn't think of as a kind of visionary of a new age. In fact, he's an extreme traditionalist, is Father Graham Rowlings, who's a priest near here. He's in Kentish Town, St. Silas the Martyr, and teaches in the church school in a very deprived part of London. 30% of the children in the school are Muslim, in fact. The Muslim parents prefer their children, many of the Muslims prefer their children to go to a religious school where they're taught about God than to a secular school where they're basically, where God is utterly ignored. And Father Graham, for years now, has been doing an annual pilgrimage. Year 3, he takes them to St. Paul's Cathedral. Year 4, Westminster Abbey, where he does a special Eucharist in St. Faith's Chapel, where the children light candles and pray. And the Muslims apparently are completely up for this. Year 5, he takes them for 3 days to Walsingham. They go to the seaside, but they also do a pilgrimage and walk barefoot from the Slipper Chapel to the shrine at Walsingham. And year 6, they go to St. Albans Cathedral on a short pilgrimage. The children absolutely love this. It's a genuine religious experience for them, an adventure. And Father Graham told me that one of the things that really surprised him at Walsingham was there were quite a few school trips go to Walsingham. But what most schools do is get the children to dress up as medieval pilgrims and pretend that they're pilgrims, as if this is some kind of theatrical performance of a theatrical reconstruction of a pilgrimage. Whereas Father Graham's children are actual pilgrims, which is so much more effective. I think the potential for pilgrimage in schools, especially at times of rites of passage, when as a rite of passage, when leaving primary school after GCSEs, after A-level, when they're starting on a new phase of their lives, I think this could be done much, much more widely and could be a very, very effective way of reconnecting children with the countryside, with a heritage, with the Christian tradition, and with holy places, and with this deep and ancient archetype. And of course, the holy places have a kind of memory based on what people have experienced there before. When you enter Lincoln Cathedral, say, you come into resonance with all the previous people who've been there, who've had the same kind of visual stimulus and so on from the same place. And they have a kind of memory by morphic resonance of that place, which I think is a very important component of pilgrimage. So I myself think that pilgrimage has a very bright future here in Britain and elsewhere. And this revival is already well underway. There's now a pilgrimage from Ireland to St. David's in Wales, walking through Ireland and through parts of Wales. There are now international long-distance pilgrimages being re-established. It's a very exciting time as we see pilgrimage reviving all around us.
Thank you, Rupert. Some fascinating thoughts there about pilgrimage, and I'm sure much to discuss. So we're going to go into our breakout rooms again, and Bill will invite us to join one of the rooms. And the questions that we're going to be looking at: share your experience of pilgrimage or sacred places. So a little bit of sharing. Why is there this revival of interest? And what's the spiritual significance of traveling the land with purpose or intention? So those will be our questions to discuss in the breakout rooms, and Bill will be sending us there any moment. Oh, lovely, we're all back again. Good to be back with you all. We're going to now go into a sort of whole group question, answer or comment session. It won't be a very long one, I'm afraid, but we're a bit short of time. But I think the easiest thing to do for me to see who is wanting to speak would be to use the reactions button at the bottom of the screen. If you click on reactions, well, I do on mine anyway, it says raise hand. So you click on raise hand and there's my hand raised, and then you click on lower hand and it lowers my hand. So if anybody would like a question or a comment, whatever. Anne Gardner.
Yes, hello. I'd like to ask Rupert what the role of intention is in your kind of thinking, please.
Well, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Well, intention means setting a goal. And there's a sense in which, when there are some people who think that intention is fundamental to the very nature of consciousness, that you set a goal and that goal then, as it were, attracts you towards it, or you're drawn towards the goal. And, we have all sorts of unconscious intentions, but setting a conscious intention helps to shape your experience or your journey in the case of a pilgrimage, and give it a meaning. If you just go on a stroll, a walk, then I suppose the intention is just being in the countryside, or in an urban setting if you're walking in a town. But if you go on a pilgrimage with an intention, then it gives the whole journey meaning and purpose. And one of the things that occupational therapists try and do is get people to do work with intentions, because it's much more satisfying to do something with a consciously chosen intention. So that's why I think it's important in pilgrimage, and what makes a pilgrimage different from just going for a walk. Intention itself, you could say that people set intentions in some extreme cases, like American self-help gurus, where you set an intention and the power of positive thinking. All of that is about setting an intention which in your mind makes it more likely to happen. But that, in a sense, is a secularization of the traditional view of prayer, which is setting intentions. I mean, thy kingdom come, for example, in the Lord's Prayer, is setting an intention for the coming of the kingdom of God. And so you could say that intention within the context of prayer is giving a kind of divine or spiritual context for these intentions, which should be in line with divine intention and things like the coming of the kingdom of heaven. So perhaps that's a rather rambling answer, but anyway, those are some reflections.
Can I just ask quickly then, in terms of resonance, if your intention is set, are you resonating with that sense of field, or is it a bit like quantum entanglement, where you're kind of interrelated in that sense then, if you set an intention?
Well, I think so. I think that if you set an intention as a goal towards which you're moving, or something that you're created as this intention, that intention may actually influence what happens, enabling it to come true. When you read all those American books like The Secret and The Power of Intention and that kind of thing, those are like creating almost magical ways of bringing about what you want. That's why I say it's a kind of, as positive thinking is the kind of secular version of prayer. If you read books like The Power of Positive Thinking by Norman Vincent Peale, it's all about selling more vacuum cleaners, or door-to-door encyclopedia salesmen who create the intention of selling 20 encyclopedias in a day, that kind of thing. And one of the greatest devotees of Norman Vincent Peale, incidentally, was none other than Donald Trump, who, as a young man, as a teenager, his parents went to the Marble Church in Manhattan, where Norman Vincent Peale was the minister, and taught them that you just have to create the intention, it'll come true. And Trump is actually an amazing demonstration of the secular power of positive thinking. It doesn't always work. Like, just when he loses an election, just say you've won it, and at least it comes true for millions of Americans. At least they believe he did win it. So there is a shadow side to this secularized power of intention embodied by Donald Trump. But in a Christian context, I think, where it's in the context of prayer, then it's not just what we want, it's a question of how it fits into a much bigger picture.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rupert. One more question. I think we're running a bit short on time, but Bridget and Fred.
Thank you, Don. Rupert, we would describe ourselves as Anglican alumni. We left the Anglican Church because of the sort of cognitive dissonance with the dogma and doctrine of the dualistic theism. We would probably describe ourselves as panentheists now. But the problem of spiritual rituals, which the church provides many, is a struggle for us, because we would love to join in communal singing-based worship. But the dualistic theology that is packed in the context and all the messages is a struggle, and for me it sort of destroys or damages the value. Any thoughts to help us, Rupert?
Well, I'm a fairly regular practicing Anglican myself, so I'm also a panentheist. You know, I think God is in nature, nature's in God, and I find that in the it doesn't bother me too much, because I think behind the theology, I mean, medieval theology, which was much more animistic and panentheistic, for me is much more interesting than post-17th century theology. So the theologians I particularly like are people like David Bentley Hart in his wonderful book, The Experience of God, Being, Consciousness, Bliss, and Matthew Fox, who's a great friend of mine, John Milbank, who's also a friend, who's the School of Radical Orthodoxy, which is really rediscovering that side of Christianity which is rooted in a kind of panentheistic view of God pervading nature and all things, rather than a separation. And I find that through the power of liturgy, it works on me quite powerfully. I mean, my favorite service is choral evensong, and going to choral evensong in a cathedral, or I quite often go to Westminster Abbey here in London, the power of the music filling the sacred space, the beauty of the words, for me is a really transformative, transcendent experience very often. And it's one reason why I and a colleague, Dr. Guy Hayward, have set up a website called choralevensong.org, where you can find choral evensong anywhere in Britain or Ireland. It'll tell you where the nearest ones are, and with one click you can go to the music list. And also now many of them stream it, so every day there's sort of 20 or 30 streaming evensongs you can go to. And I find that with the holy place, the atmosphere, the architecture, the building, the stained glass windows, such a unitive experience. It doesn't bother me too much if there's certain wording in the liturgy that I think might be perhaps too dualistic. I personally don't find it a problem, because I suppose I reinterpret it in my own way, and see the basic liturgy as coming out of a unitive process. And also, I don't really see, I lived in India for 7 years, and I suppose I've been influenced by the Hindu tradition quite strongly, in the sense of, you know, God is within us, and it's not just. Father Bede used to say that if you ask Christians, where's God? Most Christians would point up to the skies, God's there. If you ask Hindus, where's God? They go like this, say, God's within me. That when we see that our own consciousness is a kind of fractal of the divine consciousness, that our own minds are very part of a greater mind, then I think that some of these problems that the language might seem to pose, at least for me, it's not a problem. For me, it may just be that I don't take seriously enough what I'm supposed to take seriously in the liturgy, or that I interpret it in a way that some might consider heretical. I don't know. I just find whenever I go to church, I find it almost always uplifting, and I feel better adjusted to the world around me, and so I find it helpful rather than annoying. But I mean, I could easily find it annoying if I paid attention to certain aspects of it, I'm sure.
Well, thank you, Rupert.
Thank you, Rupert.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, we're approaching the end of our time together, and I just want to say a huge thank you, first of all, to Rupert for giving us so much to think about. Very erudite way of expressing yourself, and giving us the insights into morphic resonance, and also the whole idea of the revival of pilgrimage. Fascinating stuff. very extremely fascinating and exciting for the way we're heading in the future. So thank you very much, Rupert. Really appreciate you joining us this morning. Now, as we come to the end of our session, we do our usual thing of holding an intention together. And I'm going to bring up a screen on which our intention for today is set. And Jane, I think, is going to lead us through this.
Yeah, interesting. We've had a question about intention. So this is in the sense that we're all together holding this as a prayer, as an intention, as a thought form. And our intention today, which we'll hold together for a couple of minutes, is may light and love bring forth a flowering of forms to help new generations on the spiritual path.
Maybe as we come to the end, we can say that together. May light and love bring forth a flowering of forms to help new generations on the spiritual path. Finally, just to remind everybody that we have a next conscious conversation, which will be on the 29th of April. And the theme is going to be all life as part of one creation. And Ian Mole, who is with us today, is going to be speaking, plus some others from the Green Spirit group. But before that, we have on Saturday, March the 25th, we have a face-to-face event for those of you who can come. It's called Awakening to New Awareness, the Evolutionary Edges of Christianity. It's a joint event between Cana and the White Eagle Lodge, which will be taking place at the White Eagle Temple in Liss, Hampshire. There will be an online option as well, in that the talks and so on will be streamed via YouTube, so you will be able to see those if you can't make the event itself. But we'd be really excited if we can get a good turnout of Cana supporters coming to that in person. So I'm going to stop sharing that now. And I think Janice is going to blow the candle out for us as we finish today's session.
As we conclude and fully appreciate all that Rupert has shared with us, let's, as we blow this candle out, reflect for just a moment on what we are taking away from today. What light has lit up inside us? What inspiration? That we too may be part of this flowering of forms that helps all generations discover greater spirituality. So we give thanks to the angels and all beings and blow this out, our intention to be furthered in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Janice. Thank you, everybody, for being here with us this morning. Lovely to share time with you. I'm sorry I went over time a little bit, but I think it was worth it. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And bye.
Very much. That was
Thank you.
wonderful.
Thank you.
Inspiring.
Thank you very much.
Bye bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.